Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Ziyu Chen. I have to say that this is, even though it's in March now, this is our first webinar, the first episode of our quantitative history webinar series, partly because Professor Ma has been busy teaching the last few weeks, and then I've been stuck in California. So anyway, so we are very, very happy today to have Professor Robert Drennan, who is an archaeologist engaged in the comparative analysis of early complex societies from their beginnings to the enormous diversity in organizational pattern displayed by regional chiefdoms around the world. So his research focuses on identifying patterned variation in the trajectories of development of early complex societies. Topics he has worked on include regional archaeology, regional settlement and demography, community structure at all scales, household archaeology, quantitative data analysis, spatial analysis, and GIS. So these topics are all involved in his field work in China, Mesoamerica, and Northern South America. So today, he is going to share with us his recent research on various trajectories of chiefdomization. Today, we're also honored to have Dr. Dan Hoyer of the Evolution Institute, who will discuss who will offer a discussion after Dr. Drennan's presentation. So the format for today's webinar is the same as before. So Dr. Drennan will speak for an hour or so, and then followed by a 10 to 15-minute discussion. So after that, we'll move on to the Q&A session to be moderated by my colleague, Professor Zhichen Ma. So Dr. Drennan, so here is yours now.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here with you in the Quantitative History webinar. And I very much appreciate the invitation to participate. You'll start off by observing that the point of departure, really, for what I'm going to talk about today, is a series of classic social types. Depending on which author you choose, societies that have been called chiefdoms or rank societies, or going back to Lewis Henry Morgan 150 years ago, barbarism. We'll try to shift the focus from societal typology, chiefdoms, to the dynamics of change that produced the earliest complex societies, and hence the ungainly English word that we've been using, my colleagues and I, of chiefdomization. These dynamics of change are beyond the reach of history. They can only be studied archaeologically. And our approach to doing this is both quantitative and statistical. Our approach, however, contrasts with some other approaches to historical comparisons. It's much more in the spirit of John Tukey and exploratory data analysis than of Carl Pearson and classical statistics. By chiefdomization, we refer to a process that often, but not always, involves increasing spatial scale of political integration, the emergence of regional polities or supralocal communities, increasing, often but not always, I should again repeat, involves increasing demographic scale of integration, and likewise, often but not always, increasing differentiation between households and communities, and increasing mobilization of resources in a political economy. The often but not always part is important. We don't take this to be a checklist for a societal type, but rather some of the things that tend to happen as the earliest complex societies emerge and develop. The chiefdomization process, as we call it, was occurred in many different places around the world. Although the timing of this beginning and proceeding of this process has varied quite a lot. It started as far back as 10,000 years ago or more, or as recently as 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, or even less in some parts of the world. Our approach has not been to seek the main driving force in the emergence of early complex society and development in all of these regions, but to recognize that these chiefdoms show quite a lot of variety. They come in many flavors, if you will. Our comparisons explore patterns in this variation to understand the social dynamics better. This requires a much larger sample than just the 3 or 4 regions often compared by archaeologists. What we've called the Chiefdom Datasets Project compiles comparable information on around 60 natural experiments in chiefdomization. Each one represents the emergence and development of one or more regional polities. The sample is determined more by the availability of reliable data on issues that we focus on than any other factor, especially demographic factors, and especially diachronic data. Although sometimes we do look at single periods. This sample, determined more by the availability of data than other sampling concerns, reflects an approach that Marshall Solins once labeled the method of uncontrolled comparison. This means that we have to use statistical approaches that do not assume that this is in any way a representative or random sample of the chiefdomization process as it played out in different regions of the world. It reflects more than anything else the varied history of archaeological research of different kinds in different parts of the world. We compare the trajectories that lead to what we've called maximal chiefdoms with different characteristics, so as to see just what paths lead to these different characteristics. It's an effort to figure out the recipes that create the different flavors. These recipes require making some conceptual distinctions that are often ignored. In particular, lumping together all kinds of social differentiation into status or inequality is problematic. This kind of lumping is an extremely common practice in archaeological comparison, but it fails to make some distinctions that are important to understanding social dynamics. We prefer the broader notion of differentiation, which creates more varied social roles in the process of chiefdomization. These roles sometimes, but not always, involve inequalities. At a minimum, we think it's important to distinguish these 4 kinds of differentiation based on fundamentally different principles that structure human relationships in different ways. These 4 kinds of differentiation, along with raiding and warfare, together produce the varied roles and structures of human relationships that we seek to understand. The different kinds of differentiation must be distinguished conceptually so as to be able to investigate the relationships between them empirically and not simply assume that they all go together. We can't make that assumption, or at least we better not make that assumption, on the assumption that all kinds of differentiation march along together, because in terms of actual empirical fact, they don't. One can have a great deal of wealth differentiation and very little prestige differentiation, as we'll see, or the reverse. Ritual differentiation combines with wealth differentiation or prestige differentiation, creating different pathways of chiefdomization. There's much to be learned by looking at how they do, in fact, combine in different ways. And so that also implies that we have to figure out the empirical archaeological evidence for each one separately and not take one of them to be an indication of any or all of the others. Archaeology presents a uniquely complicated and challenging relationship between material remains that can be observed directly from ancient times and the ancient human activities and patterns of organization that we take those material remains to represent. This uniquely complicated and challenging relationship has as one of its implications that a reliance on the secondary literature in archaeology and a reliance on regional expertise can be extremely risky in comparative analysis. As an example, we can have a quick look at a classic archaeological line of evidence for inequality: burials. And one classic example from central Panama. This extremely elaborate burial from Sitio Conte, burial 11, which contained the interments of 23 elite individuals and a massive amount of elite goods. This burial, together with other evidence, has been used to argue that the societies of ancient Panama had fiercely unequal, fiercely hierarchical, fiercely unequal social organization. And this conclusion is firmly entrenched in the literature that all of us read about central Panama. Moving on to the southeastern US and the Mississippian Society centered at Moundville, Alabama, burials here have also been used to support the conclusion in the archaeological literature that a similarly strong hierarchical social organization obtained at Moundville. But these are the offerings included in the most elaborate burial ever excavated at Moundville. So elaborate that it was called the Great Chief of Mound Sea in newspaper accounts at the time it was excavated. In the popular imagination, not only of non-archaeologists, but also of archaeologists, Moundville and Sitio Conte have similarly strongly hierarchical social organization. But there's a world of difference between the evidence behind them. This burial and the goods from burial 11 at Sitio Conte don't indicate the same degree of social differentiation. And it cuts the other way as well. Moving on to Puebloan societies in the southwestern US, specifically Chaco Canyon and Pueblo Bonito, it's easy to find plenty of accounts of Pueblo Bonito in the secondary literature described as a very egalitarian society without strongly hierarchical organization. And yet, here are the elite goods included with burial 14 in room 33 of Pueblo Bonito, the central site for Chaco Canyon. This Pueblo Bonito burial would suggest not an egalitarian society at all, but inequality far beyond Moundville. Despite this, the impression of non-hierarchical society in Chaco Canyon has been extremely persistent. Comparisons then have to get beyond or behind, better said, behind the secondary literature. Comparing the conventional wisdom about these three regions just won't do here. A valid comparison really has to build directly on the primary archaeological data and the voices of regional experts, regional expert authority, need to be resisted or at least examined critically. The risk of simply accepting separate expert judgments about different societies, different regions that are to be compared, the risk is that our comparisons wind up being not of patterns of organization in ancient societies, but of habitual patterns of thought in modern archaeologists who specialize in researching societies of ancient regions. And that's not what we want to compare. We need to base comparisons quite firmly and directly on the primary evidence, not filtered uncritically through the voices of regional experts. Quantification can be a big help in dealing with this problem if it's directly based on primary empirical archaeological evidence and avoids comparing those pesky regional specialist thought habits. But quantification is not a task for robots. It has to be done with great care and deep understanding of archaeological contexts and of the methods of archaeological data collection and interpretation. Some especially vexing challenges in accomplishing this revolve around sampling at several different scales. And the archaeological use of the Gini coefficient provides examples of sampling problems at two of these scales. The Gini coefficient has become very fashionable in archaeology for measuring inequality, and it is indeed a powerful tool. It's an index of how unequal a society is. The Gini coefficient is based on a Lorenz curve on a graph like this, a graph that plots cumulative proportion of usually households on the x-axis and cumulative proportion of wealth on the y-axis, some archaeological indicator of wealth. If the Lorenz curve lies exactly on the diagonal of the graph, all the households are equal, and the Gini coefficient is 0. If the Lorenz curve departs a little bit from that diagonal, then there's some degree of inequality. The Gini coefficient is low because the area between the Lorenz curve and the diagonal is small. As the Lorenz curve departs more and more from the diagonal, the Gini coefficient increases as an index of greater and greater inequality. Okay, archaeologists borrowed this index from economists. And so we archaeologists have tended automatically to assume that it must always be about economic inequality. Really, it's not necessarily about economic inequality at all. It can be an index of the unequal distribution of anything, whether that thing is related to wealth or not. And this means that careful thought is required about whether the archaeological observations on the basis of which a Gini coefficient is calculated really do relate to wealth or to something else, perhaps to some other kind of inequality. First off, archaeologists applied the Gini coefficient to burials. As I said before, a classic indicator in archaeology of inequality, usually assumed to be wealth inequality. But sometimes burials are clearly much more about prestige differentiation than about wealth differentiation. It requires careful attention to the ways in which burials and their offerings are different. More recently, it's become especially fashionable to apply the calculation of Gini coefficients to variation in house floor areas within a community. There's probably a better argument to be made that house floor areas are related to wealth differentiation as a general rule than that burials are. At least often, but not always. I think this is the case. And this brings us to the sampling issues that I mentioned. First off, sampling at the local community scale, and Teotihuacan, the famous center of complex societies and classic period, the late formative and the classic period in the basin of Mexico. If you want to find a local community where the full range and distribution of wealth inequality in basin of Mexico society in the formative or classic period is well represented, Teotihuacan is the right place to look. Archaeologists calculated a Gini coefficient of 0.12 on house floor areas at Teotihuacan. This result indicates an astoundingly egalitarian society. But the Lorenz curve is really peculiar. It has an unusual long segment paralleling the diagonal for most of the graph. This represents an enormous and very homogeneous middle class. And that's what creates the very low Gini value and the indicator of very little inequality. But there's a sampling problem here. These calculations are based on a tiny sample of excavated house floors from an enormous site. All the rest of the data, practically all the data, are imputed missing values. Missing data is a perpetual problem, perpetual sampling challenge for archaeologists. We could never manage to excavate all the house floors at Teotihuacan. Even remote sensing and other kinds of techniques that are becoming available could not give us house floor areas for but a small proportion of them. But we can't impute almost all of them. The problem here in particular is that the assumptions made to impute missing data values for almost all of the house floor areas is tied very closely to the mean area of the 34 excavated house floor. The Gini coefficient depends almost entirely on the shape of this variation, but the assumptions focused almost entirely on the mean and paid no attention to the standard deviation. We could make different assumptions and impute a higher Gini coefficient and impute data values and calculate a higher Gini coefficient for Teotihuacan. We could calculate 0.128, 0.301, 0.33, or higher. These are not results that are compatible with an egalitarian society. I hasten to add, these higher numbers are not necessarily more reliable results, but they're equally plausible. The point is that if 99.8% of the data values are missing, imputation of missing values so as to calculate a Gini just won't do. We have to confess that we can't calculate a Gini coefficient for Teotihuacan. This Gini coefficient, though, has spread quite widely and come to be used as part of the evidence and an argument presented in books like this written for the public to support the notion that Teotihuacan is an example of an extremely egalitarian ancient state running against all conventional wisdom that all ancient states are highly inegalitarian. This conclusion based on the Gini coefficient simply has no sound empirical basis. Moving to a larger scale of sampling and continuing to look at Gini coefficients. Teotihuacan represents in a major way the difficulty of getting data on enough house floors at a single site to calculate a valid Gini coefficient for that site. On a larger scale, the question arises of finding a site or a sample of sites that adequately represent the society whose degree of inequality one wishes to evaluate or not. On a larger scale, we're almost always in archaeology limited to a single site, which, like Teotihuacan, we take to be representative of a larger society. Teotihuacan probably does represent the degree of inequality in the much larger society of which it's the principal place. The sampling problem there is getting enough households to calculate a valid Gini. Turning to the capital of Middle Kingdom Egypt at Thebes, its capital at Thebes covers 36 square kilometers. This would be a good community to calculate a Gini coefficient to represent Middle Kingdom Egypt. But much of its 36 kilometers, far too much for us to excavate, and much of its 36 square kilometers are underneath modern Luxor. We'll never have a large enough sample of house floor areas. So the site of Kahun has been used because it was excavated extensively a century ago. It's a Middle Kingdom site with lots and lots of excavated residences that you can see in this plan. The archaeological sampling problem at the local community scale seems nicely resolved. This is a really large sample of residences, large ones, small ones, lots of house floor areas. A Gini coefficient can probably be calculated reasonably well on these data. They probably do represent the range and the variation of house floor areas at Kahun. The trouble here is the relationship that this community bears to the larger society of Middle Kingdom Egypt that we'd like to evaluate inequality within. Unfortunately, Kahun is a really unusual settlement. It's an encampment of pyramid laborers and their overseers. This hardly can be taken to represent Middle Kingdom Egyptian society at large. Middle Kingdom Egyptian society at large assuredly had high inequality. But the Gini coefficient of that's been calculated for Kahun is a higher Gini coefficient than that for any modern nation state, according to the World Bank, one of the highest Gini coefficients ever calculated. Even though Middle Kingdom Egypt's inequality was assuredly quite high, it's assuredly, as a society as a whole, not as high as at this one unusual community. The Kahun community simply can't be taken to represent Middle Kingdom Egypt. And at a yet larger scale, there are sampling issues that we have to think about in archaeology. Archaeological cultures are not meaningful social units to sample from for calculating a Gini coefficient. Archaeological cultures can be vast and include many different, chiefly polities, as in this map, based on careful work by Liu Li, which delineates a half a dozen late Longshan chiefly polities in the central plains of China, and locates a handful of other Longshan walled towns, which may well be the centers of different polities on their own. These polities may vary importantly from one to another, just as Liu Li quite properly recognized in her analysis. And the differences and interactions between them may be important to social dynamics. Homogenizing the differences in a monolithic characterization of a culture remains common practice in archaeology. But this erases a vital part of the social dynamics that we need to focus on. We can't just calculate a Gini, for example, on a large sample of burials or house floor areas from sites scattered all over an enormous culture, all lumped together. They represent different polities that may have very different levels of inequality, even though they belong to the same archaeological culture. For our purposes, An emerging regional polity is the proper unit of analysis, as it was for Liu Li in the paper that this map is paper whose data this map is based on. We can't thoughtlessly combine regional settlement analysis from one polity with interpretations of burials from another polity and household artifact assemblage data from yet another polity into a single homogeneous of a culture, a single homogeneous characterization of a culture. We need to document regional trajectories with a succession of well-documented, chiefly societies, and such trajectories are simply not numerous in the documented archaeological record. We need to study as many of those trajectories as we can, but as many regions of the world where archaeologists have done quite a lot of work, there simply are not very many regional trajectories that provide the kind of data that we need to document a sequence of periods and the characteristics that we'd like to see of the changing regional polities whose development we study. So I'll confess once again, data availability has loomed larger than we might like in our selection of natural experiments. The point here is not that quantification of social characteristics from archaeological data is unreliable. And I underscore that. I'm not arguing against quantification of social characteristics from archaeological data. And I'm not arguing that there's no resolution to these sampling issues at 3 scales. We're not arguing that these sampling issues can't be resolved. Christian Peterson and Adam Berry and I, and a number of other colleagues on our team have spent a good many years now trying to resolve these challenges. But it is challenging. It requires combining both a considerable depth of expertise in quantitative analysis and in archaeology. It's important to understand fully what's going on with the numbers we calculate, really understand what the numbers are trying to tell us, and at the same time, really understand just how far the inevitably imperfect archaeological data we have to rely on can be stretched before it reaches the breaking point. So what we're looking for is more reliable approaches to quantitative characterization for comparison in several domains. We've tried for reliable quantification in 3 main domains. First, in the domain of interaction and social relationships, which I mentioned before, we aim for comparative ranking of these 4 kinds of differentiation and of the intensity of raiding and warfare in a polity, period by period through archaeological time. The ranking is very simple, 5 categories: little or none, low, moderate, high, and very high. We have not relied on regional expert judgment, either from the literature or from collaboration. This is not from lack of respect for the knowledge and expertise of regional experts, but to avoid the problem of lack of comparability in their assessments. We've assigned the ranks ourselves with constant reflection and critical examination of how they relate to the primary data that they're based on and how the ranks relate to each other across the comparisons we're trying to make. In absolute terms, it doesn't matter all that much whether the correct description of, say, ritual differentiation should be low or moderate. What really matters is that we get societies that are highly similar to each other in this regard in the same bin, and societies that are different from each other in different bins, and societies that are very different from each other in bins that are even farther apart. This is the approach we've taken to try to assure that we get reliable rankings for the vital variables that define new social roles and relationships in the process of chiefdomization. Second, we work in the domain of demography. And here we're more confident in relying on systematic analysis of regional settlement data, quantitative analysis. We apply the same methods of analysis to primary archaeological survey data at local and regional scales to provide approximations of the variables that you see on the screen. The local communities that we can delineate are the crucial interaction matrix that people live in. The regional communities, the regional polities we can delineate are the societies that chiefdomization produces. Their populations, densities, centralization, and spatial scales have varied impacts on the nature of human interaction in these societies as they develop. And these analyses have required the development of new analytical approaches, ones that haven't been used before, and ones that are especially suitable, especially robust, I should say, and suitable for applying to varied data sets that have been collected by less than identical methods. Even with very robust methods, the data from most regional surveys are not adequate to the task. And this has been a primary limitation in the regional data sets that we're able to analyze and compare. Third, we attempt to quantify variables in the domain of political economy. We make systematic quantitative estimates of labor invested in different kinds of public works, large structures made for different purposes. Again, we go to primary data on the size and characteristics of these public works. We use estimated labor rates consistently across the board so that our estimates, while they may not be exactly right in absolute terms, are comparable across the regions that we're working with. Demographic estimates, together with labor investment estimates, give us what we refer to as tax rates. That is a rough indicator of the burden of growing political economies on the populations that sustain them. This is an important component of human well-being in the ancient past. And we would like to see archaeologists more interested in human well-being in the ancient past. It's an important and highly relevant subject to study. Okay, in these domains then, we look at the variables in all three domains, and they reveal enormous variation in the characteristics of the maximal chiefdoms in their respective regions. Every single characteristic varies so widely as to defy any simple description of chiefdoms, any of the definitions of chiefdom or ranked society or barbarism as a societal type, in which all of the examples share a checklist of characteristics. The overall means and correlations of these variables, we think, are less enlightening than the frequency distributions, the modes, and the outliers. Plotting these variables through time reveals more variation and more patterning. And this is where the really interesting pattern tends to emerge. The American author Mark Twain reportedly said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme." And this is the attitude with which we've approached the comparison of plots of variables through time. Plots of variables through time, simple examination of these plots of variables through time, together with cluster analysis and multidimensional scaling, reveal bundles of chiefdomization trajectories that rhyme with each other. These bundles represent societies following different pathways through chiefdomization. They show what leads to what, and they lead to maximal chiefdoms with different social characteristics. The bundles suggest causal linkages that make substantive good sense and put us on the track of causal relationships between what happens in chiefdomization trajectories. Once such rhyming bundles are identified, they can be summarized in graphs of changing mean values of variables for each bundle of trajectories. The first step is to align the trajectories of development for each region according to the beginning of sedentary living. This facilitates comparison of overall rhyming of chiefdomization. Then, following a familiar pattern from exploratory data analysis, we do something very akin to setting aside the level by realigning the trajectories according to the beginning of sedentary living in respective regions. We further shift to looking at trajectories in terms of the beginnings of the chiefdomization process. And this is really what's most like setting aside the level and exploratory data analysis. Once the level is set aside, we do something like setting aside the spread in order to be able to overlay rhyming patterns in time of the chiefdomization process, rescaled to the span between initial chiefdoms, the first emergence of regional polities, and the sort of maximal development of these regional polities. Years then become, time in years becomes developmental time, and the rescaled plots set aside the fact that the chiefdomization process started at different points in time and ran at a different pace in different regions. These rates at which chiefdomization proceeded once started make it much harder to see the rhymes. So we can see the rhymes and times. And just as in setting aside the level and spread and exploratory data analysis, we can recognize unusualness, unusual examples in the chiefdomization process, exceptions that prove the rules, unusual examples that help us to understand the bundles of rhyming trajectories that account for many more of the trajectories that we observe. We're in the midst of the process of delineating bundles of trajectories but I can wrap up by talking about the kinds of bundles of trajectories that we're identifying and the kinds of understanding of developmental dynamics that looking at these bundles and comparing and contrasting them with each other especially brings us. We identify one bundle of trajectories, which shows societies that are strongly structured by prestige and ritual differentiation. Elites in these societies are quite strongly set off from others. The lines of archaeological evidence that reveal this are some of the classic lines of archaeological evidence used for the purpose: burials, houses, household artifact assemblages, and they show strong differences between households within local communities. But these are not differences in terms of standard of living. Standards of living tend to be quite similar across households in these societies. The households that are strongly set off seem not to be so much wealthy as they are highly respected or prestigious, based on the character of burials, the artifacts included in them, the differences that we see in household artifact assemblages and the way they reflect differences of certain kinds of activities between households. It appears that prestige in this bundle of trajectories owes a great deal to religious and ritual roles of elite individuals and households. Productive differentiation plays a supporting role in some regions, but not usually a very important role. Neither raiding and warfare nor wealth differentiation appears much at all in these trajectories. When we look at demographic variables, we can further suggest that quite a lot of this pattern originates in the way sedentary living was established in the first place. This bundle of trajectories tends to unroll in regions where there was either very little subsistence risk to buffer, or such subsistence risk as there was to buffer could be buffered by individual households acting separately. It did not call for much cooperation between households. Absent much solid need for cooperation, a settlement pattern was encouraged that consisted largely of scattered farmsteads and small low-density villages right from the beginning. In these scattered farmsteads and small low-density villages, distance interaction principles meant that productive differentiation, the interaction of exchange, and economic interdependence between households and local communities were not much encouraged. There was a high degree of household self-sufficiency. Without much in the way of goods changing hands, one ready opportunity for wealth accumulation in society was missing. The dispersed residence pattern, though, was more than adequate for ritual interaction. And so as inequalities emerged, as differentiation emerged, it tended to take the form of ritual and prestige differentiation more than wealth and productive differentiation. The natural experiments that comprise this bundle are in different parts of the world. It's not a pattern that is only found among the societies in one region, or that is exclusively found in the societies of any region. It occurs in different places where the conditions that can start this process off are present. in at least many of the societies or trajectories that we've examined in this bundle, the logic that I just described of the establishment of early sedentary living in very dispersed form does seem to characterize the trajectory, although we don't argue that this is the only way that this particular combination of characteristics can come together. Another bundle of trajectories is structured strongly by wealth differentiation and productive differentiation, which take on higher values than any other form of differentiation. In these societies, elites also stand out quite strongly from other households. Same lines of evidence, burials and their offerings, houses, household artifact assemblages and their contents and varied proportions. But in this bundle, the differences that we see do indicate differences in standard of living. That is, these elites seem to be wealthy, unlike the elites that emerge in the previous bundle. The societies in this bundle, we'll look at where they are in a minute, but all of the societies we've looked at in this bundle so far, or all of the trajectories that we've looked at in this bundle so far, go on to larger scale integration, usually labeled states, or at least neighboring regions do, if not the precise region in which we've studied the chiefdomization process. So as can be seen in this graph of averages, mean wealth and productive differentiation don't peak sharply and then decline. Ritual differentiation rises, but stays at a lower level, suggesting that in at least some regions, it can help legitimize wealth. Raiding and warfare rise to higher levels in general in this bundle of trajectories than in the one I described just a few minutes ago. And these may also play an important role in wealth accumulation. Prestige differentiation is not as strongly developed, clearly does not play as important a developmental role. In all of the regions that we've looked at and that are characterized in this way, where the bundle of trajectories that we would characterize in this way. Risk buffering, agricultural risk buffering is important in the establishment of sedentary agricultural living. And it's most effectively accomplished with a much higher degree of household cooperation than in the other bundle. That cooperation can take a variety of different forms. There's no one particular environmental characteristic or particular mode of cooperation or activity, cooperative activity that's important. But cooperation among multiple households is a good strategy for dealing with subsistence risk. Cooperation of this sort means frequent interaction among households, and this encourages the formation of large compact villages in this bundle of trajectories. Large compact villages provide a setting where productive differentiation can easily flourish and where well-integrated local economies form. The movement of goods in a well-integrated local economy is an easy target for aspiring wealth accumulators and seems to be an important vehicle for wealth accumulation in this bundle of trajectories. Eventually, this bundle of trajectories wind up creating the familiar urban growth spiral of mutual causality and continued increase in demographic scale and development. The natural experiments that comprise this bundle are also from different parts of the world. It's not something that only happens in one place, and it's not the exclusive pattern of any very large part of the world, although of some regions, it is. A good many of the natural experiments whose trajectories we've looked at fit one or the other of these two bundles. We're now in the process of delineating other bundles and locating more unusual trajectories in relation to them so as to examine just what makes them unusual. I'm sure we'll find that it's a lot more complicated than just the little taste of it that I've been able to present tonight. But we think that the patterns that are already emerging are extremely interesting. This kind of quantification of archaeological data and comparison of trajectories is obviously a team project. So my co-authors, Christian Peterson and Adam Berry, and I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to our collaborators, the members of our team, in compiling these data and making the comparison possible. And we thank all of you for your attention. I look forward to discussion and questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Drennan. So now we are going to the discussion session. Today we are very happy to invite Dr. Daniel Hoyer from the Evolution Institute to give his discussion. And later we will turn to our Q&A session from the audience. Okay, so Daniel.
Well, thank you so much. And first of all, thank you, Jiwoo and Qisheng, for inviting me to this talk. And of course, thank you, Robert. Really excellent talk and excellent summary of what I know is a lot of years and a lot of work on all of these efforts. It was just really fantastic to see. I think that I want to make maybe a couple of just observations and points, just sort of stressing some of the points that you made that really resonated with me in particular, and then maybe ask a couple of leading and perhaps unfair questions, and we'll see sort of what you want to do with them.
That's always
I think first of all, yeah, exactly. I think first of all, I wanted to say that, you know, what's so exciting to me about sort of your work and the project you guys are doing is really just recognizing, first of all, that commonalities and variation are two sides of the same coin. Like, it's really not discrete processes. These are just how we understand dynamics of change. I think that's a really good way to put that. And I think, you know, when you're doing comparative work, it's so easy to sort of reify one or the other, you know, looking for what's common or looking for what's different. Really, we just want to understand change over time in different regions at different scales, and then understand what happens to be similar or unique in those processes. Like, that's really an excellent focus. I also say that, you know, as you mentioned, more and more emphasis on studying well-being and the dynamics of well-being in the past, both in archaeological and historical periods, is very much central to my heart. So I'm very glad to see this also being echoed in your work. And I'm going to ask you a little bit about that in a minute. I also wanted to say, you know, you talked about sampling issues and all the various issues that are involved. I think this is common to any quantitative history project, whether you're working with archaeological material, even when you're working with, you know, supposedly more well-documented historical and recent cases, you're still dealing with all the issues that you mentioned, you know, missing values, the representativeness of your sample, making sure that you're comparing leg to leg. I think those are really crucial issues that we sort of, as a community of quantitative historians, need to be a little bit more explicit on, and the different methods and approaches that we can take than we have been. I will say that, you know, in my mind and sort of some of the work that myself and my colleagues are involved with, it's, you know, in addition to being very sort of clear about, you know, how you can build a sample, how you can build a representative sample, and the different kinds of statistics that are appropriate to analyze that, this is really where theory comes in. And I think, again, archaeologists, anthropologists, maybe less so, certainly historians, are often reticent to really engage in theory in a sort of proper formalized way, but being able to sort of articulate theory, to test theories against the empirical evidence, computational modeling, various other sort of things that we can do. You know, it's not just simple imputations, as you say, but really, you know, making sure that we are making theoretically informed predictions about what we think ought to happen, and then using the material evidence to test against that. I think that's a good way to balance some of the inherent biases that can creep into our work in the ways that you document. So I just wanted to sort of flag that as another path forward. And I guess lastly, my point, this is really, as I said, exciting work. I'm very eager to see how it progresses and when you start presenting the data publicly and letting people like myself get to play around with it, because it's really excellent. One of the things I think moving forward is, as you documented these different trajectories of chiefdomization, where your graph ends up, I think, is a really important and interesting avenue for future research. Is yes, you have this path of chiefdomization. The next step is then, okay, we have another trajectory from sort of chiefdoms to super chiefdoms or small archaic states or whatever you happen to, however you want to describe that next step. And being able to document that full range of dynamics and the full range of change, and in particular, looking at the causal relationships there. And one of the, I think, big open questions for our field is whether we want to identify the same causal factors that are driving sort of initial chiefdomization processes and that kind of subsequent step. Is it simply the accumulation of wealth, or is it the accumulation of, say, prestige, or the capturing of prestige by particular individuals that leads that forward, or are there other kinds of processes that are sort of distinct in, say, the archaic or early archaic periods versus sort of early chiefdom organizations? And so I think this is a really ripe area for future research. Which brings me, I don't want to talk too much. This brings me to my actual questions, which is, first of all, I wanted to ask you about the causal relationships and sort of any causal analysis. You did mention it briefly and pointed out some of what you have identified as the key drivers of the particular trajectory bundles. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, and in particular, sort of how consistent, how common are the key causal factors in the different bundles that you had, and how exactly do you see the causes driving the variation in the trajectories, recognizing that these trajectories are all kind of going to the same place, right? They're all going to similar chiefdom type outcomes. And so what's your current understanding of the causal forces there?
Yeah, I would say that I'm more impressed by the variability in chiefdoms than by the similarities. Mm-hmm. So I think that these bundles of trajectories are winding up in societies whose different characteristics are fairly impressive. Yes, there certainly are commonalities that I started out with. We're generally talking about increasing differentiation, a greater variety of social roles, more complexity of structure, human relationships, increasing demographic scale, increasing spatial scale. All of these things are kind of commonalities in the process. And yet the way these increases play out and the way the nature of the roles and relationships and the way they're structured really do give different chiefdoms. I like the flavor metaphor. They give chiefdoms different flavors. Mm-hmm. They may all be ice cream cones, but they're really different flavors. So just as you say, I think there's a very complementary relationship between figuring out between focusing on the commonalities and sort of what's common and central to a process, and our particular axe to grind is the other one. So we're specializing, we're differentiating, we're engaged in productive differentiation by specializing and looking at the variation, because we think that that's a field that has not been plowed as much, and it offers an awful lot of potential for helping us to understand the underlying dynamics. I think in doing that, we're at a very exploratory stage, and I think that's one of the reasons that Chris Peterson and Adam Berry and I are much attracted to a kind of EDA approach to things, because we think there are a lot of features that have not been paid much attention to or explored, that people haven't tried very hard to quantify or to compare. When we talk about what seems to lead to what, which is the way I'm most comfortable talking about causality in these bundles. What leads to what? What kind of thing leads to this flavor of chiefdoms? What kind of thing leads to a different flavor? When we look at that, it has to be considered a hypothesis that we're suggesting that may be found in a number of instances, a pattern of a particular sequence of things that lead one to another, that's repeated in different parts of the world. We've seen it at least in a good big handful in each of these bundles. But there's potentially an infinite variety of trajectories, and the trick in all of this is not getting lost in the idiosyncrasies, and finding enough patterning that you can find some consistent relationships of what leads to what. And so I think that eventually the kind of focus that we're taking on patterns and variation can converge with analysis that's heavily focused on sort of the main driving forces behind the chiefdomization process, to give us a more fully rounded and complete understanding of chiefdomization than we would get by taking either route alone.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And I would say it sounds like you're kind of already along that process. And even just in your sort of brief talk, you mentioned both the kind of ritual and prestige type of trajectory and the wealth differentiation trajectory seem to be kind of driven in a large way by, or at least generated in a large sense by, the relative vulnerability of subsistence processes in the early sedentary process, right?
And the nature of the human responses that are appropriate.
Yeah.
Whether they're responses that can be carried out by individual households acting on their own, which encourages very dispersed living, or whether they really require cooperation of a substantial number of households. And many different kinds of environmental conditions can have one or the other effect. But that seems to be an important kick that gets these two bundles going in different directions because of the interaction implications of large compact villages versus really scattered residents.
Yeah, which is, again, to me, what's really going to be interesting is to see if it's that same kick is kind of common to all the trajectories that you end up identifying. And that, to me, I'm always interested in what's common in the similarities and the patterns. And, just the fact that if you could have a more or less, central driving force that's common, even though it results in very widely different trajectories, as you say, given the variability in the human responses to those initial conditions.
Yeah, I think the central issues are questions of differentiation and increasing demographic and spatial scale. That's common to both bundles. Why is it? One could take a complex systems kind of approach, but the sort of general overarching questions are: why do you get increasing differentiation? We're after, why does it, how does it come to take such different forms, and how does that help us understand the process? I don't think probably that's going to give us an answer, not an easy and direct answer anyway, although I think it'll have some implications. For what are the driving forces that push human societies towards greater differentiation so often? I think not always, but so often. It's a question of increasing numbers of and kinds of social roles, increasing variety of relationships and ways of structuring those relationships.
Yeah,
so
very well put.
The variation is there, and the commonalities are there too.
Yeah.
And I hope anyway that a focus on both things can eventually converge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my somewhat more unfair question is, speaking of what leads to what, just because you did talk early on about, inequality and sort of that being a common popular topic in archaeological research these days, well-being, as I said, it's something very close to my heart. I'm just wondering, have you been able to sort of find any patterns of what kinds of trajectories lead to what kinds of well-being outcomes? Like, do you have a sense of, in sort of low versus high wealth differential cases, do you see any, indications of different well-being, living standards, life expectancies, prevalence of diseases, et cetera, these kinds of things?
Yeah, that's a question that has in which our interest has grown. And it was not in the front of our minds as we started this study out. And it certainly does interest us more and more. It's obviously a point of relevance to the modern world. Archaeology ought to be able to contribute to fundamental understandings of how human societies work that can help us manage our societies better today. And looking at human well-being in this context does indeed fascinate us. One element that was not much present at all in my discussions of the bundles that we're delineating yet, that's related to well-being, is tax rates.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of burden that political economies place on populations. And we're certainly accustomed to thinking in archaeology that complex societies involve the mobilization of large amounts of resources in a political economy. And pyramids and other large-scale constructions like that are the poster child for heavy tax rates and large quantities of forced labor and heavy burdens placed on a sustaining population. What we're finding as we approximate the labor involved, and as we estimate the populations of the communities that sustained such works, is that we're consistently surprised at how low are our absolute estimates of the tax rates. They're not nearly as large as we're accustomed to thinking. And that's really intriguing. But they do vary, certainly. And I would say that's the part of our analysis that is least finalized as of now. We have the most tentative ideas about that. So that's been less a part of what we're able to link up with these bundles so far. But I think that's probably the thing in the analysis that we're carrying out that most directly strikes this issue of well-being, and it's the direct consequence of forms of political organization and the kinds of burdens that they place on their populations.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Yeah, and to me, very important to talk, as you say, about taxation as the burden that is placed on the citizenry. But the other thing that you mentioned as part of your bundle is public goods, and the sort of taxation. Yeah, it's kind of a burden, but it also has to be linked to, well, what do you get out of it? Like, what are you putting in? But then what do you get back? Is it irrigation works? Is it something that is benefiting large members of the community? Even pyramids, yeah, they are the poster child for heavily burdened tax regimes, but they're also a public good. Like, they are a key point of the societal ideological moment, even if it's just glorifying one particular ruler. Like, there is an ideological payoff to something even like an Egyptian pyramid, let's say. And so I think
they all play a really important role in political integration. Sometimes in direct, lowest level practical importance agricultural production, like canal systems and raised fields and things like that. Sometimes in a different way in terms of defensive works, and sometimes in what we'd usually classify as a less directly practical way, as you say, where the implications are ideological, but they can provide the ideological glue that keeps societies together. And one can ask the question about whether societies that are integrated through largely ideological glue, ritual-based prestige systems, characteristically place really heavy burdens on their populations or much lighter burdens on their populations. One can think about the benefits and the burdens.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, relatedly, what I would want to say is, okay, yeah, let's ask that question and then say, do, let's say, a society that's held together by ritual glue and places a heavy burden on its populace to support it, are they more cohesive? Do they last longer? Do they seem more stable than, say, other forms and other trajectories? And asking those kinds of questions as well, I think is, again, speaking of the implications of your work, really interesting.
And that's the ritual-based prestige bundle tends to develop and reach a kind of maximal point in demographic and spatial scale and degree of differentiation, and then recede or even disintegrate sometimes pretty spectacularly. It's the other bundle, the wealth-focused bundle, that where the trajectories tend to go on, either in the very regions that we studied or in closely neighboring regions to much larger scale political integration.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting as well.
And so some of those seeds are there right at the beginnings of sedentary living as people begin to settle down and as the earliest complex societies begin to develop. There's trajectories that are being pushed in different directions that have different outcomes eventually. Yeah,
really interesting. I don't know, I don't want to take too much time. I know that there's questions from the audience that we need to get to. Maybe I'll ask one.
We still have time. It's fine.
So I'll ask, I guess one final question, sort of from my end and just from what I'm thinking. One of the other things that really struck me in your talk and in the way that you characterize these trajectories is you mentioned raiding and warfare as one of the aspects of the bundle as well. And I take it that this is kind of raiding and warfare that's perpetrated by the focal polity. I'm wondering if you are thinking about the other way around of sort of raiding and warfare and conflict that is sort of incurred or at least threatened by neighbors in the way, again, thinking of public goods, thinking of some of the centralization processes and some of the defensive fortifications, the need to have defensive specialists, military specialists, et cetera. Again, as one of these sort of fundamental catalysts of these kinds of chiefdomization processes is, in fact, the interaction of neighbors. So not just local ecology in terms of subsistence strategies and demands, but local ecology in terms of, well, who else is around your environment and what kind of a threat are they posing to you? Is that, if you sort of looked at those kinds of inter-polity or inter-village, let's say, interactions?
Yeah, that's a tough one. When you find defensive works, of course, are one classic kind of evidence of raiding and warfare that's really conspicuous in the archaeological record. So you don't need a lot of really sophisticated studies. There they are. There's these massive walls and things and some archaeological sites, and so you can't miss them. But we set out initially to formally code sort of what kind of network of polities, what size network of polities was the one that we were focusing on the development of, a part of. And we can as it has turned out, we can't say nearly as much as we thought we might be able to about that. It's really hard. It becomes really hard to say how many other polities there were around. I should have mapped based on Liu Li's work. We do have an idea because of an awful lot of archaeology on the central plains of China and careful work like the work by Liu Li that map was based on. We can talk about Longshan polities existing in as quite a large number of probably competing and conflicting polities. Maybe even into the hundreds, but certainly dozens or scores of Longshan polities within what's the archaeological Longshan culture. But it turns out that's an unusual case. We thought we could put an approximate number on it, and we found it so difficult to do for so many of the regions that we're working with that we are getting queasy about that variable and how reliably we can work with it. We may have to speak more anecdotally about regions where we do have some confidence in saying that, and they run the gamut. The Valley of Oaxaca, a chiefdom developed into a state in splendid isolation. It had no nearby rivals until way on down the track. And in other places, in the Alto Magdalena of Colombia, for example, 20, 30 regional polities sort of appeared on the scene almost simultaneously, as near as we can tell, in archaeological periods, and were there bumping and jostling in some way from the beginning, although they don't seem to have been much engaged in raiding and warfare.
Interesting, very interesting.
But
Yeah.
you've raised a fascinating question that I'll try to wiggle out of right in advance. We're not going to be able to give a very good answer to it.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. Yeah, and hopefully, as you say, more digs are coming, more evidence is uncovered. Even things like skeletal evidence of trauma and violence, like those other
skeletal evidence is really good there.
Yeah,
really good, and that's certainly accumulating at a rapid rate for a lot of regions.
Yeah, and hopefully, once that reaches a kind of threshold, then you will be able to sort of detect those kinds of signals that you would need to weigh in on that, which would be great.
Okay, thank you both. Very nice conversation and discussion. So now in the remaining 10 minutes, let's turn to the question from audience. Maybe some questions have been partially addressed. We just briefly respond to this question. The first question comes from Xiaopeng Ren. The author showed us the general pattern of chiefdom evolution. That's amazing. My question is whether or not regional differences on this pattern, at least between East-West comparison from archaeology data.
Differences between East and West?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I think one of the really interesting things is that there are members of both of the two bundles of trajectories that I talked about just now from the Americas and from China. These patterns that we see don't seem to characterize a particular part of the world. They just don't split up that way. I'd be very surprised if once there are enough of them, we don't find that they're more numerous in one part of the world than another. But right from the beginning, with only a modest handful of members in each trajectory, we're finding examples on both sides of the Pacific and both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay, thank you. So the second question is from Tim Kohler. I'm sorry if you answered this. My internet connection was going in and out. How do you measure wealth or perhaps wealth differentiation in your work? And how is that related to well-being in your analysis?
Yeah, we measure wealth by ranks, little or none, low, medium, high, and very high, based on multiple lines of evidence, and paying attention to the qualitative characteristics of the evidence that suggest in burials, in household assemblages and the like, whether we're talking about wealth differentiation or some other kind of differentiation. And in making the judgments of what bin to put a society in, we pay less attention to sort of the absolute definition than to assuring that we're convinced that societies with similar primary evidence that speaks to strength of wealth differentiation get in the same bin, and societies with different primary evidence speaking to the strength of wealth differentiation get in different bins, and societies with very different evidence of wealth differentiation get in very different bins.
Well, so the last question is from Professor David Mitch. Very impressive project. You mentioned at the beginning that the term chiefdomization was a bit awkward. The concern occurs to me that by seeming to conceptualize the project and the focusing on the chiefs, perhaps begs questions and introduces pre-assumptions about the role of elites in processes of cooperation and the trajectories of cooperation.
The question of elites is bound up in inherently in some of the kinds of differentiation. Wealth differentiation and prestige differentiation inherently involve inequalities. And so in each of their senses, they distinguish elites from non-elites. Other kinds of differentiation, ritual differentiation, is more ambiguous. The extent to which ritual differentiation necessarily implies inequalities and elites and non-elites is less easy to answer than with wealth differentiation and prestige differentiation, which are just inherently unequal. Productive differentiation doesn't necessarily imply any inequalities at all. Butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers can be fully equal in a society, and so the mix of different kinds of differentiation has a lot to do with the level of inequality in a society, and the way that differentiation plays out, and the dynamics of its development. Certainly, when we think of sort of main driving forces, some of the things that people have often talked about are the aspirations of self-aggrandizers and the drive to lord it over other people. And yet there are kinds of differentiation that don't necessarily involve that level of inequality. And these aim more in the direction, productive differentiation, for example, ritual differentiation to some extent, aim more in the direction of societies that have been discussed recently under headings like collective action.
Okay, great. So so finally, Professor Zhu Chen, I guess you want to ask some questions now.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Zhu Chen. Well, thank you very much, Dick, for the presentation, for sharing your work, and also Dan did a wonderful job. So I have three kind of related questions that may sound similar to some of the points the three participants have asked. The first one is how far along your Chiefdom datasets project is. If you can actually give us a little bit more color, that would be great. Some more details, because we have been constructing some big archaeological project, not specifically just focused on chiefdoms but for China, collecting data on from all available publications on archaeological discoveries. So if you could share some more details with us, that would be great. The second question is, this is related to what you have been saying earlier in response to a question. When you collect, it's very clear from your charts, you have many more chiefdoms included in your data set, I guess, from Mesoamerica and Northern South America. And then you have some from China and so on. Like in a lot of the recent quantitative history studies, especially on long-term persistence, there has been, well, some of the work by Jared Diamond clearly makes it clear that he emphasizes so much on the impact of geographic factors on trajectories of civilizational development and so on. So when you include chiefdoms from South America together with those from China and so on, I imagine that the background drivers for some of the, I mean, between at least the two big groups, two big bundles, must have been quite different, biogeography and so on. I mean, from our own work, I mean, at least I've become pretty convinced that the Chinese civilization really got a first big boost from the formation of walled settlements or walled urban centers or walled cities. Because once you have several hundreds or several thousands of people being forced to live within a very small enclosed settlement, population density would just go high, go so much higher, and then all the social complexity, developments and governance challenges would actually have to take place in order to make the walled city life sustainable on a continuous basis. But I guess from my trip to Mayan urban center, I guess I did not see I did not see walls like encircling. I don't know whether it's a common thing that in Mesoamerica, they did not start their civilization from walls, enclosing walls, forcing people to live within and so on. So I guess that's just like, maybe my observation is just not right. I mean, so if you can give a little bit more color on that, that'd be great too. I guess
Sure,
let me wait for the third question.
Yeah, and your two questions do kind of connect to each other. Enclosing walls around major centers are not particularly common in Mesoamerica, but hilltop fortified sites do occur in a number of regions. They may have to do more with polity boundary defense, and certainly some major centers did have fortifications. Monte Alban in Oaxaca had a defensive wall, but it's not the massive thing that Longshan walled towns, for example, represent. And it didn't really enclose the city. Its location on a mountaintop was itself highly defensible from most directions, and the wall tends to cut off the easier approach. So it takes a very different form. I will pick up on your observation that large settlements packing substantial numbers of people close together is a really important variable in all of this. Really important. And that leads directly to your first question, which was, why is our sample so heavily slanted towards the Americas and a bit in China and pretty thin for a lot of the rest of the world? That's because of the history of regional settlement pattern research and the importance of demography in our analyses. Systematic regional settlement pattern research has been pretty common and pretty widespread in the Americas for 50 years. And so there are a good many regions where we find we can work with the comprehensive systematic settlement data that's available. We can look at the clustering that reflects the centrally focused interaction of communities at a local scale and delineate local communities and talk about their populations, and at a regional scale and delineate superlocal communities that are the regional polities that are chiefdoms. We can do this kind of thing, which we regard as just fundamental. If you want to study the chiefdomization process, you've got to manage to get your hands around a chiefdom and know how many people lived in it, how they were distributed, how spatially extensive it was. Vital variables, and they come from systematic regional settlement analysis. And so our sample reflects more than anything else the history of regional settlement research and archaeology. Abundant where it's been abundant, and a lot sparser where that kind of evidence has been sparser. And this is saying a lot more than just survey. Archaeologists in all parts of the world do survey to look for sites that might be neat to dig or whatever. And the kinds of survey that are motivated by many such purposes simply are not systematic enough to produce data for demographic analysis. It's like a census taker only going to the houses that look really interesting. You don't get good census data. And that's what we're really most interested in regional settlement data for. So that's the primary reason behind the unevenness of worldwide distribution of our sample. And defensive works, well, they're certainly a notorious feature of early China. They really stand out much more strongly. And that particular kind of evidence of reading and warfare is not exclusively Chinese, but very Chinese. And at the same time, there are other kinds of evidences of reading and warfare that show that reading and warfare was really endemic in the Andes, probably from very early, certainly by relatively later in the sequence. It may have been more variable in Mesoamerica, and there are going to be these kinds of differences from one part of the world to another. But I think it's interesting that as we begin to define these bundles, we're not finding that they're restricted to one part of the world.
So my last maybe quick question is related to the drivers of the chiefdomization process. So David Bish just mentioned cooperation. So it may be cooperation to do different things was a very major driver of the process. I know, like using China as an example, this long-held conjecture about irrigation being the main driver of the formation of the first Chinese state. But my reading is that actually, if that was the case, that happened much later. It was way after a lot of chiefdoms were already formed. So maybe cooperation for defensive fortification projects, to build walls or defensive canals and so on. So the challenge to survival related to intertribal wars and so on may be a more fundamental or much earlier driver of first some chiefdomization, and then much later, it led to the formation of a formal centralized state. So I wonder whether you look for certain key drivers of the process of chiefdomization.
Sure, I think we're less focused on the main drivers than on what produces variation, because we think that's an angle that's been particularly overlooked, and that we can learn a lot from. But forms of cooperation and variation in the frequency and intensity of cooperation, we think is an extremely important variable. Hence the importance of demographic data, size and compactness of local communities, spatial and demographic scale of emerging regional polities. These are the interaction networks that things were happening in. And cooperation, or the relative absence of cooperation, this is a really important variable in structuring interaction, or in creating intensive interaction. And we think that it's by way of needs for different kinds of interaction, that these environmental variables, or variables like the need for defending yourself against other societies. These things all seem to have a center of gravity in cooperation and interaction. between households. And that's an important central variable, I think, both in general in the emergence and development of chiefdoms, as well as variation in that, driving variation and chiefdomization trajectories. I think that one variable has an awful lot to do with a lot of aspects of the chiefdomization process, and that's why Peterson and Barry and I and our collaborators have focused so much on demography and looking at those interaction, the scale of those interaction networks, the distribution of those interaction networks, the way distance interaction principles imply differences in kinds of interaction based on population numbers and population distribution. This is really at the crux of it all. And that's why that has taken first place in choosing regions that we think we can work with.
Thank you. Yeah. Dr. Chen.
Okay, so time's out. Thank you so much for Professor Drennan's very fascinating work and Dr. Daniel Hoyer's very excellent discussion. So we will forward the remaining question from audience to Professor Drennan for his consideration. Okay, and
very good.
Yeah, finally, our next webinar will be after 2 weeks. We will have Professor Kamral Ashraf from Williams College as our speaker. And for audience who are watching our live streaming in YouTube or Facebook, you are welcome to sign up to our mailing list to receive the latest news for the future event. Okay, so thank you again. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks.